You'll never guess what happened one afternoon when my mom and I were simply trying to enjoy a quiet day at home. We've all had that moment where someone pushes us too far, but what happened here was on a whole new level. It all started when we least expected it, and I'm still in disbelief about how far things escalated. It was a normal, peaceful afternoon. My mom, who suffers from asthma, was having one of her good days. She was sitting in her favorite chair by the window, sipping her tea and watching the neighborhood go by. I was finishing up some work in the living room, just the usual office stuff, nothing out of the ordinary. My mom had a good routine, and everything was calm. Then, the doorbell rang. Now, you might be thinking, it's just a doorbell, no big deal. But in our neighborhood, unexpected visitors aren't something we get often. The HOA usually sticks to sending out emails or leaving flyers in the mailbox, but rarely does anyone knock on your door, especially without any prior notice. So when I opened the door, I didn't think much of it at first. Standing there was the HOA manager, a man I'd seen around but never really interacted with. He was wearing his usual dark suit, his glasses perched on his nose, and a clipboard in hand. He had this overly polite, almost rehearsed smile on his face, and for a moment, I thought maybe it was just a routine checkup or a notice about the community event they'd been talking about for weeks. After all, as residents, we were all expected to contribute, follow certain guidelines, and sometimes participate in these community activities. Nothing too invasive. But what came out of his mouth next was far from what I could have imagined. "I'm here to talk to your mother," he said, and even though his voice was calm, there was a certain edge to it, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. I paused for a moment, unsure what exactly this was about, but I decided to let him in. I mean, what harm could there be in a friendly conversation, right? Boy, was I wrong. He walked past me into the living room without asking permission, his eyes scanning the room as if he were inspecting the place. My mom, sitting quietly, looked up from her chair. The moment he saw her, he didn't even greet her. He simply said, "We've had complaints about your attitude, and it's becoming a problem. We need to address it." I was taken aback. Complaints about my mom? About her attitude? I glanced at my mom, who looked equally confused and uncomfortable. My mom has always been one of the kindest, most reserved people I know. She's never been one for confrontation, and the idea that she could be involved in any kind of dispute was baffling to me. Complaints? About what exactly? I asked, my voice rising with confusion and irritation. My mom hasn't done anything wrong. The manager continued, as though his earlier statement hadn't just caught me off guard. You see, she's been causing quite a stir in the neighborhood. People say she's rude, unapproachable, and she's been isolating herself from the community. It's starting to reflect poorly on the image we're trying to maintain here. His words were cold, like he was reading off a script, and there was an arrogance in his tone that made my blood start to boil. I could feel my mom's discomfort growing, and I stepped closer to her, instinctively placing myself between her and this man. "What are you talking about?" I said. "My mom isn't rude, and she has every right to live her life the way she wants. She's not here to socialize with everyone, and if she's not participating in your community events, that's her choice. What does that have to do with anything?" The manager seemed unfazed by my defense. In fact, he almost looked pleased by the rising tension. "We've had multiple reports. It's about maintaining harmony in the neighborhood. If people are uncomfortable, it becomes an issue for the HOA." He paused and took a step closer to my mom, who was now visibly uncomfortable in her chair. I was starting to feel like I was in some surreal situation. This wasn't just a routine checkup, it felt like a personal attack on my mom for no good reason. Her attitude, whatever that meant to them, was nothing more than a fabrication. My mom had done nothing to deserve this treatment, and yet here we were, having to defend her character over a baseless complaint. But the next words out of his mouth left me completely stunned. "And that's not all. Because of your behavior, I'm going to need to confiscate something of yours." "Confiscate?" That was it. I snapped. "You're going to confiscate what?" I demanded. "This is our home. You have no right to take anything from my mother, especially based on some ridiculous complaints. But before I could react further, the manager went on. I'm going to need to take her inhaler, he said with an air of finality. It's part of the process. I froze. My mind couldn't process what he just said. My mom, who suffers from asthma, always kept her inhaler nearby. It was a critical part of her health, something she depended on. But here this man was, telling me that for no reason at all, he was going to take it from her, simply because he thought she had a bad attitude. The HOA had always been a bit overbearing, but nothing that had ever seemed to cross the line. They were known for sending out regular notices, making sure everyone was adhering to property rules, and keeping the community in check. It wasn't the kind of place where people caused trouble, but it was a place where rules were strictly followed. I assumed the HOA manager's visit was just another check-in, probably about some minor infraction like a lawn that wasn't mowed to their standards or a fence that needed repainting. After all, I had seen him walking around the neighborhood before, clipboard in hand, keeping an eye on things. But when he started speaking, something in the air shifted. There was a subtle but undeniable change in his tone. He came in with a smile on his face, offering a polite greeting, but there was a certain coldness behind it. His eyes were scanning the room, almost like he was taking stock of every little thing. It was unsettling, but I dismissed it, figuring it was just his professional demeanor. Then, without any preamble, he said it. Your mom has been causing some issues around the neighborhood, his voice low and firm, sending an immediate chill down my spine. I paused, unsure how to react. My mom? Causing issues? It made no sense. My mom had been living in this neighborhood for years, always maintaining her privacy and keeping to herself. She wasn't the type to stir up trouble. In fact, she barely spoke to anyone outside of our small circle of friends and family. Whenever she did interact with others, it was always kind, polite, and respectful. I stared at the manager, trying to figure out what he was talking about. What do you mean, causing issues? I asked, genuinely confused. My mom hasn't done anything wrong. She doesn't bother anyone. The manager seemed unfazed by my question. He continued, almost like he was reading off a script, she's been rude to the other residents, and it's creating a bad image for the neighborhood. People have been complaining, and we need to address it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My mom, rude? The thought of it was laughable. It didn't add up. There was no way she could have upset anyone, let alone caused enough of a disturbance for complaints to be filed. My mom had always been a quiet person, a woman who valued peace and privacy. She wasn't the type to engage in confrontations, much less make others uncomfortable. If anything, she went out of her way to avoid unnecessary interactions. Complaints? Who's complaining? I asked, growing frustrated. I needed answers, but the more I listened, the more the whole situation seemed absurd. He avoided my gaze and shifted on his feet before responding. I'm not at liberty to share the names, but the complaints have been consistent. Multiple residents have come forward. I glanced over at my mom, sitting in her chair by the window, her hands nervously twisting in her lap. She wasn't the type to speak up for herself, but I could see the confusion and frustration in her eyes. I turned back to the manager. That doesn't make any sense, I said, trying to keep my voice calm. My mom doesn't even talk to most of the neighbors. If she's ever had a conversation, it's been cordial and brief. Are you telling me that a few isolated incidents are enough to accuse her of ruining the neighborhood? The manager's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered, leaning in as if to make a point. It's not just about conversations, he said, his voice growing colder. It's about the attitude. People are saying she's unapproachable, that she's making others uncomfortable. That's a problem for the HOA. We're a community, and everyone needs to contribute to that sense of unity. Unity? What unity was he talking about? My mom didn't owe anyone anything. She had a medical condition that required her to stay indoors most days, and when she did venture outside, it was usually to her car or to grab the mail. It felt like the HOA was just looking for any excuse to pick on her, to put the blame on someone who wasn't actively participating in their little social bubble. The more the manager spoke, the clearer it became that this wasn't really about my mom's behavior, this was about control. But then, just when I thought the conversation couldn't get any more bizarre, the manager dropped the bombshell. "I think it's time we discuss this properly," he said, his voice now colder and more authoritative. "And I'm going to need her inhaler." I froze. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What? You want to take her inhaler?" I asked, my voice rising in shock. "Are you serious?" He nodded, almost as if he were expecting this reaction. "Yes, I believe it's necessary. We need to ensure that there are no issues with your mom's health interfering with the community's concerns. The inhaler, well, it's part of the process." I felt a wave of anger rush through me. This was it. This was no longer about complaints or petty neighborhood squabbles. This was an outrageous violation of my mom's privacy and health. Her inhaler wasn't some item they could just confiscate because they didn't like her attitude. My mom had a right to that medication, and they had no right to take it from her based on unfounded claims. I stood in shock for a moment, trying to wrap my head around what was happening. I couldn't believe what this HOA manager was suggesting. His words hung in the air, and the tension between us grew thicker by the second. It was clear to me now that this wasn't just about enforcing rules or maintaining peace in the neighborhood. This was personal. Now, you might be wondering why in the world anyone would need to take someone's inhaler, especially in a situation like this. But let me break it down. My mom suffers from asthma, a condition that can cause her to struggle to breathe when triggered. For her, the inhaler isn't just some small object, it's literally a lifeline. She's relied on it for years to control her symptoms and ensure that she can go about her day without the constant fear of an asthma attack. Without it, she risks serious health complications and sometimes even life-threatening situations. So when the HOA manager started talking about taking her inhaler, my mind went into overdrive. I couldn't process what he was saying. Why in the world would he think it was acceptable to take someone's essential medication? To make matters worse, he was accusing my mom of using the inhaler as a tool to manipulate people. Yes, you heard that right. He actually suggested that my mom was using her asthma to manipulate the neighbors, as if her needing an inhaler was somehow an act. It was absurd. This wasn't just about health anymore. It was about power. The manager wasn't just criticizing my mom's attitude or behavior. Now, he was attacking her health and implying that she was using something as serious as asthma as a way to get attention or gain sympathy. I could feel my blood boiling as I processed the situation. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding or even a miscommunication. It was a calculated move by someone who felt they could control people's lives with their position in the HOA. They were overstepping their boundaries, and I wasn't going to let it happen. At this point, my patience snapped. "You can't take her inhaler," I snapped, my voice shaking with anger. "That's ridiculous, and you have no right to do that." My mom was sitting silently in her chair, visibly stunned, her hands clutching the inhaler as though it were the only thing keeping her grounded. I could see the confusion in her eyes, but more than that, I could see the fear. She knew as well as I did that without her inhaler, things could quickly spiral out of control. She couldn't believe that someone was trying to take it from her, someone who didn't even have a legitimate reason to be involved in her health in the first place. The manager, however, didn't seem fazed by my protest. In fact, he actually stepped forward, his hands reaching for the inhaler with a calmness that made the situation even more unsettling. "I'm sorry, but this is for the greater good," he said coolly, his voice dripping with the same patronizing tone he'd used throughout the conversation. "It's part of the process, and it needs to be done." I felt my heart race as I took a step forward, blocking his movement. "No!" I shouted, feeling the urgency in my voice. "You can't just take something like that. You're talking about her health, her life. You don't get to make that decision." But the manager didn't listen. Before I could react, he reached forward and grabbed the inhaler out of my mom's hand. I stood there in stunned silence, watching as he casually took it from her, like it was just another item on his checklist. The entire moment felt unreal. I couldn't believe my eyes. This wasn't happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go down. It was my mom's medication, something so vital to her well-being, and here was this man treating it like it was a toy he could just take for no reason at all. I was frozen, standing there with my mouth open, unable to fully comprehend what was going on. He didn't even acknowledge us as he turned and walked toward the door, inhaler in hand, as if it were perfectly normal for him to take someone's medication. My legs felt like they were made of lead, and I could barely breathe through the rising panic in my chest. My mom's inhaler, the very thing she needed to survive in certain situations, was now in the hands of a man who had no understanding of her condition and no right to take it. As he reached the door, I snapped out of my daze. "Hey!" I shouted, rushing toward him. "Where do you think you're going with that?" He paused, looking over his shoulder with that same smug expression. "I'll be back once everything's settled," he said in an almost dismissive tone. "This is just a formality, and you'll get it back once your mom has been assessed." Before I could even respond, he opened the door, stepped outside, and left, closing it softly behind him. The door clicked shut, and for a few seconds, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart. I looked at my mom, who sat there in stunned silence, her face pale and her hands shaking slightly. I could see the fear in her eyes, the same fear I was feeling. What kind of world had we entered where someone could just walk in, take something that was critical for her survival, and walk out like it was nothing? I knew I couldn't just let this go. There was no way I was going to sit back and let this man take something so essential from my mom without consequences. This wasn't just a matter of an HOA dispute. This was about her health, and I wasn't about to stand by while someone tried to take that away from her. As the door clicked shut behind the manager, I made a vow to myself, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That was the moment I realized that things had gone too far, and I was about to take action. But little did I know that what would come next would take everything to a whole new level. I could feel the anger building inside me as I realized what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about some imaginary attitude issue or minor rule breaking. No, this was personal. This was something far deeper than a simple neighborhood squabble, and it was becoming painfully obvious that the HOA manager had an agenda, one that involved controlling people and enforcing his own vision of how things should be run in the neighborhood. It wasn't about my mom's behavior or any complaints from neighbors. It was about power, control, and his desire to manipulate the residents. For years, I'd watched how he had treated others in the neighborhood. He had this way of bullying people who didn't fit his mold, people who either refused to conform to his standards or didn't participate in the community events that he seemed to think everyone should be a part of. He targeted those who didn't play by his rules, making life harder for them until they either gave in or left the neighborhood entirely. It was a tactic he'd perfected over time. But my mom? She wasn't one to be intimidated. She'd never been a part of his little social games or his so-called community events, and she had always been content living her quiet life. She didn't care about the HOA's petty rules, and she certainly wasn't going to bow down to someone who thought he had the right to dictate how everyone should live. It wasn't like she had caused any trouble. In fact, she had always been respectful, kept to herself, and maintained her property according to the guidelines. But for some reason, the manager had decided she was an easy target. At first, I couldn't understand why he was going after her. It didn't make sense. But as the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place, I realized that the situation had escalated beyond just a simple complaint. The HOA manager had a history of targeting people who didn't fit his ideal of community, and my mom, with her quiet, independent nature, was the perfect person for him to pick on. The more I thought about it, the more I began to connect the dots. For years, the manager had been pressuring residents to conform, to attend meetings, join events, and get involved in whatever his vision of the neighborhood was. Those who didn't comply were subtly, or not so subtly, ostracized, fined, or harassed in some way. It wasn't about keeping the neighborhood clean or following the rules. It was about his need for control. And when people like my mom refused to play along, he made them his targets. But here's the thing. My mom had never backed down from a fight in her life. She was a fighter by nature, and she wasn't going to let this man take her medication or her dignity. She had spent too many years standing up for herself and others, especially when it came to issues of health and fairness. So, as the realization hit me, I knew this was only going to get worse if we didn't take action. But there was something more important about to happen, something that would turn the tables in a way we never saw coming. While I was stewing in my anger, plotting how to take action, my mom sat quietly in her chair, gathering her thoughts. She had always been someone who thought before reacting, and I could see that she was deep in thought, formulating a plan of her own. She had seen enough of this man's behavior to know what kind of person he was, and she knew he was crossing a line. But she also knew that the best way to deal with people like him wasn't through anger or confrontation, it was through strategy and surprise. She reached into her bag and pulled out something that none of us had expected. My mom wasn't just a typical homeowner. She wasn't someone who just accepted things at face value. She wasn't someone who would let a man like this take advantage of her or her family. And what she had in her bag was about to change everything. She pulled out her FBI badge. At first, I didn't understand what she was doing. I had no idea that she still carried it with her, even though she had retired from active duty years ago. But in that moment, I understood. She wasn't just my mom. She wasn't just a woman who had been harassed by an HOA manager. She was someone with the authority and experience to take control of the situation and make sure that no one, especially this manager, could push her around. Her eyes met mine, and I could see the resolve in them. She wasn't going to let this man get away with what he had done. This wasn't just about getting her inhaler back. It wasn't about the HOA or some petty neighbor complaints. It was about standing up to someone who thought they could control others with intimidation. And my mom wasn't going to let that happen. With a steady hand, she slipped the badge into her pocket, the weight of it solidifying her decision. She knew what had to be done. She knew how to handle people like him. And soon, the tables would turn in a way that none of us had ever expected. This was no longer about a simple confrontation. It was about bringing justice to a situation that had been mishandled from the start. My mom was about to show this HOA manager that there were consequences for overstepping boundaries, and we were prepared to do whatever it took to make sure that he understood just how far his abuse of power had gone. As the anger and frustration continued to build, we both knew that the next move would change everything. And we were ready for it. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I saw my mom calmly reach into her purse. She moved with a deliberate and measured calmness, as if she'd already anticipated this moment. I watched in stunned silence, still reeling from everything that had just transpired, as she pulled out a small leather wallet. The action seemed almost surreal. How could this woman, my mother, who had been so calm throughout the entire ordeal, be preparing to turn everything on its head in a matter of seconds? And then, it happened. Without a single word, she held up her FBI badge. Yes, you heard that right, my mom is an FBI agent. Though she had long since retired from active duty, her years of service had molded her into someone who could face almost anything with an unwavering sense of duty and composure. She didn't need to say a word. The badge did all the talking. The second the manager saw it, his entire demeanor shifted. The confident, smug expression that had been plastered on his face since he walked into our home disappeared in the blink of an eye. His eyes widened in pure shock, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, he seemed genuinely unsure of himself. He froze for a moment, like a deer caught in headlights. His lips parted as if he were trying to find the words, but none came. "I think you made a mistake," my mom said, her voice as sharp as a knife, cutting through the tension in the room like butter. Her words were calm, yet there was a steel edge to them that left no room for argument. She didn't raise her voice, but the weight of her tone conveyed everything she needed to say. She wasn't angry, she wasn't flustered, she was just in control. And she knew exactly how to handle this. "You took something that doesn't belong to you," she continued, her gaze locking on the manager's eyes. There was no fear, no hesitation. This was a woman who had seen far worse in her career and who had dealt with high-pressure situations many times before. She knew exactly how to get results, and this moment was no different. The manager's face flushed red, and I could see the nervous sweat starting to form on his forehead. His hands, which had previously been so confident, now looked unsure. His back was stiff, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other, clearly struggling to process what was happening. He stammered as he tried to find words to explain himself, but it was too late. He was in over his head, and he knew it. I didn't mean to cause any trouble, he finally sputtered, his words coming out in a nervous jumble. I thought it was necessary. I didn't mean to, but my mom wasn't having any of it. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she stepped closer, closing the distance between them in a way that only added to the pressure he was feeling. The manager took a step back, almost instinctively, but my mom didn't relent. Her eyes didn't leave his. The room was thick with tension as she stood there, unmoved and unshaken. You don't get to take my inhaler, or anyone's personal property, just because you think you have the authority to do so, she said, her voice unwavering. You stepped over a line, and now you'll have to face the consequences. The manager opened his mouth to say something else, but no words came out. He realized that no matter how much he tried to justify his actions, he was in no position to argue anymore. The authority in my mom's presence had completely shattered his facade. He wasn't dealing with just another upset resident, he was facing someone who had the power to end this immediately and make him regret his actions. The mere presence of her badge had changed the dynamic of the entire encounter. I'm going to need that inhaler back, my mom said calmly. Now. The manager, clearly overwhelmed and panicking, quickly nodded and stepped aside. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the inhaler, handing it back to my mom without another word. He was fumbling, his hands shaking as he did so. It was almost like watching someone who had just realized they were completely out of their depth. Without missing a beat, my mom took the inhaler from him, inspecting it for a moment before tucking it back into her purse. She didn't thank him, and she didn't need to. The message had been delivered loud and clear. He had overstepped his bounds, and now he understood that there were consequences for actions like his. Before the manager could leave, my mom spoke again, her voice still icy but resolute. I suggest you rethink your approach next time you decide to interfere in someone else's personal life. You've crossed the line today, and if it happens again, it won't be so easy. With that, the manager slowly backed away, eyes wide, his head down, clearly beaten in this round. He made no attempt to argue further. He simply turned, muttered a half-hearted apology, and left the door open as he quickly exited our home. I stood there in awe. The calmness, the control, the precision with which my mom had handled the entire situation, it was like something straight out of a movie. I had never seen her use her FBI skills in real life, but in that moment, it was clear she was a force to be reckoned with, and the HOA manager was lucky that this had ended as smoothly as it did. As the door closed behind him, the weight of what had just happened slowly began to sink in. My mom had just taken back control of the situation, and in doing so, she had made it clear that no one, not even an overbearing HOA manager, could trample over her rights. I looked at her, still in awe. That was incredible, I said. She gave me a small, knowing smile. Sometimes, you have to remind people who they're dealing with. And with that, she returned to her chair, completely unruffled, as if nothing extraordinary had just happened. But I knew, in that moment, everything had changed. The tables had turned, and we were in control now. The second my mom flashed her FBI badge, the HOA manager's self-assurance evaporated like steam in the sun. His once cocky demeanor melted into sheer panic. His eyes darted from the badge back to her face, unable to process what was happening. I could see the color draining from his face as he stood there, now caught in a situation far beyond his ability to control. He was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he fumbled with his words. I didn't know. I thought, he stammered, his voice rising in pitch with every word. It was almost comical how quickly his confidence had disappeared. For a moment, I felt a mix of pity and amusement, seeing him completely unravel before us. This man had walked into our home, taken my mother's inhaler, and tried to justify it with flimsy excuses. But now, faced with the reality of who he was dealing with, all his bravado had disappeared. My mom, however, wasn't interested in his excuses. She had heard enough. She didn't need to hear him stammer and blubber his way through a series of apologies or justifications. She had made it clear from the start that this was not something she would tolerate. She wasn't here to make small talk or listen to his pathetic attempts at explanation. Without a hint of hesitation, my mom spoke in the same cold, measured tone she had used throughout the entire confrontation. "You took something that doesn't belong to you, and I'm going to need it back immediately," she said, her voice sharp and unwavering. "If you don't return my inhaler right now, I'll be filing charges against you for theft and harassment. You've crossed the line, and you will answer for it." Her words hit him like a ton of bricks. The power dynamic that had once been completely in his favor had shifted in an instant. The authority he thought he wielded over the neighborhood suddenly seemed insignificant. The realization that he had made a critical mistake and was now up against someone who had the power to hold him accountable had finally hit home. The poor man looked like he was about to collapse. His eyes widened with panic as his mind raced for a way out. He began stumbling over his words, trying to apologize, trying to explain, but it was clear he was no longer in control of the situation. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I thought it was necessary. I didn't know. Please don't," he babbled, his voice trembling with fear. But my mom didn't let him off the hook. She wasn't interested in half-hearted apologies. She had seen this kind of panic before, and she knew exactly how to handle it. She wasn't going to let him wriggle out of his mistake with empty words. "This is beyond, I didn't know. You took something that belongs to me, and now you're going to fix it," she said, her tone cold and stern. "I don't care if you were following orders or if you thought this was a routine check. You have no right to take my property, and I'm not letting you get away with it." The manager's face was now flushed with embarrassment and regret. He had clearly underestimated my mom, and now he was paying the price. His earlier arrogance had completely vanished, replaced by an overwhelming sense of fear. He apologized profusely, over and over again, each apology more frantic than the last. "I'm really sorry. I'll return the inhaler. I'll do whatever you want. Just please, don't report me." My mom didn't respond immediately. She simply stood there, watching him with an unwavering gaze. The power was now in her hands, and she wasn't going to let him forget that. After what felt like an eternity of him stumbling over his words, she finally spoke again, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "This isn't over," she said. "You've broken the rules, and you've violated my trust. I expect an immediate apology in writing, and I want you to submit a full report to the HOA board about what happened here. If anything like this ever happens again, if you ever step foot on my property or take anything from me again, you will be dealing with far more than just an apology." Her words were calm but firm, leaving no room for misinterpretation. This wasn't just about getting her inhaler back. This was about setting a boundary. This was about making it clear that her rights were not to be trampled on, and that she would stand up to anyone who tried to overstep. The manager, still shaking, nodded rapidly. Of course. I'll get the report to you as soon as possible. I promise, this won't happen again. I'm really sorry, please forgive me." At this point, my mom finally let out a quiet sigh of relief. She had made her point. She had taken control of the situation and had made it clear that no one would be able to walk all over her, not even an overzealous HOA manager. She accepted his apology without any further comment, and then, with a quick glance in my direction, she handed him the inhaler. "Don't let this happen again," she warned one last time, her voice firm but not unkind. "Now, leave. You've done enough." The manager, eager to escape the situation, nodded quickly and scurried out the door without another word. As soon as the door closed behind him, a wave of relief washed over me. It was over, but it wasn't just about the inhaler. It was about standing up for what was right, about taking back control when someone tries to take advantage of you. My mom had handled it with grace and precision, and I couldn't have been prouder. And for the HOA manager? He learned a hard lesson that day. Never underestimate the person you're dealing with, especially when you're trying to control something you don't fully understand. The HOA manager quickly ran off, practically stumbling over himself as he exited our home, his shoulders hunched in defeat. My mom, ever so calm and collected, slowly tucked her FBI badge back into her purse, the faintest of smirks crossing her face. The tension that had gripped the room moments before seemed to melt away, but the gravity of what had just transpired lingered. The inhaler had been returned, yes, but this was about so much more than that. It wasn't just about the physical possession of an inhaler, which, though critical for my mom's health, was merely the symbol of the greater violation that had occurred. No, this was a message, and my mom had sent it loud and clear. It was a message to the HOA, to anyone who thought they could push around people who simply wanted to live their lives in peace, free from unnecessary interference or unjust accusations. The manager had taken something that didn't belong to him, under the pretense of some fabricated attitude problem that didn't exist, and in doing so, he had crossed the line. He had assumed that he could control my mom's life and her personal belongings because he held some sort of perceived authority. But my mom wasn't the kind of person to let that slide. She wasn't just fighting for the return of her inhaler. She was fighting for her dignity, for the dignity of anyone who had ever been unfairly targeted by the HOA, and for the right to live without fear of harassment from those who believed they had power over others. The fact that this man thought he could take something so essential from her without consequences was unacceptable. He hadn't just infringed on her rights, he had made an unjustifiable assumption that he could wield his position as a weapon. And that's exactly what my mom was determined to stop. Once the door closed and the manager was gone, we both let out a sigh of relief. The tension in the air had lifted, but the underlying frustration still lingered. My mom leaned back in her chair, and I could see her silently reflecting on the situation, her calm exterior masking the anger she had no doubt felt during the confrontation. We both knew the fight wasn't over. It wasn't just about getting the inhaler back, it was about sending a message that no one had the right to bully others into submission. True to her word, the next few days were a whirlwind of action. My mom wasted no time in getting the HOA to issue a formal apology, not just to her, but to the entire community. She made sure that a letter was sent to all residents, acknowledging the incident and offering an apology for the manager's actions. But that wasn't all. She also insisted that the HOA issue a formal reprimand to the manager for his overreach and that an independent review of his behavior and actions be conducted. The HOA, despite their initial resistance, had no choice but to comply. They had to cover their tracks and avoid further escalation. They were caught in a bind. And as the apology letter made its rounds, something incredible started to happen. The tone in the neighborhood began to shift. People who had long been passive observers of the HOA's overreaching behavior began to speak up. They saw what had happened and realized that, for the first time in years, someone had stood up to the HOA's bullying. My mom had set an example. She had shown everyone that it wasn't enough to simply tolerate unfair treatment, it was time to take action. As the days went by, we began hearing from neighbors, many of whom had been silently suffering under the HOA's rule. Some had been fined for minor infractions they hadn't even known about. Others had been harassed for trivial reasons, just like my mom had. And now, they were finally realizing that they didn't have to endure it anymore. People began to organize, discussing ways they could hold the HOA accountable and make sure that no one else would be treated the way we had been. The atmosphere in the neighborhood started to change. More people attended HOA meetings, and some even formed a small group to ensure that all community decisions were fair and transparent. There was a new sense of solidarity among the residents. Everyone had witnessed the power of standing up for what was right, and it was empowering. My mom had unknowingly sparked a movement that had rippled through the entire neighborhood, making everyone more aware of their rights and the importance of challenging unfair practices. And as for the HOA manager, he hasn't been seen much around here since that day. After the formal reprimand and the scrutiny he faced from the HOA, It became clear that his days of harassing residents were numbered. It was rumored that he was reassigned to another neighborhood, though no one really knew for sure. Whatever the case, it was a relief to know that he had been effectively neutralized. The power he once wielded so recklessly was gone, and he had learned the hard way that there were consequences for crossing the line. In the end, my mom's calm and collected response had done more than just secure the return of her inhaler. It had set a precedent. It had shown that standing up to injustice, no matter how small it seems, could make a difference. It had proven that a single act of courage could change an entire community. And it had reminded us all that we should never allow anyone, no matter how much power they think they have, to take away our rights or make us feel powerless. The lesson was clear: when faced with injustice, speak up. Because, as my mom had shown, sometimes the quietest voices can make the biggest impact.